Today I'm going to do a quick lecture on chapter 21 dealing with the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa is a really important turning point in African history because if you look at the modern map of Africa today, the countries in Africa, their borders are about 95% the same borders that were created at the Berlin Conference in 1885. And so Africa as we know it today is very much a byproduct of the Europeans coming in and divvying up Africa at a conference in Berlin in 1885. I mean, really, the only significant deviations, there's a few of them. I mean, if you look at Sudan today you have northern and southern Sudan. Eritrea became independent again, although at a certain level, that's kind of a reversion back to the colonial map because Eritrea had been a separate colony away from Ethiopia. If you look, for instance, at in North Africa, where the Moroccans took control of Spanish Sahara, I mean that's a deviation from the old map. But by and large, the political boundaries we see in Africa are the boundaries that were created then. Well, anyway, so let's get to the point. Why did Europeans divvy up Africa? Prior to this, as you see in the book, there had been the era of legitimate trade, and by and large, Europeans were really content to leave African rulers in charge of Africa. Europeans tended to have small territories on the coast primarily. Like in a place like Nigeria, they controlled Lagos. In Ghana, they controlled the area that would become Accra. The French, however, had larger territories. They had larger territories in the area of Senegal and going into what nowadays is Mali. The one really big exception was South Africa. South Africa had been expanding throughout this time. Going back to the 17th century, there had been a continual expansion of European presence in South Africa. As Shillington mentions, the Portuguese had territories that were big on the map, but in terms of effective control, they tended to only control relatively small areas. But as we can see, in a very short period of time, this changed. And as Shillington mentions, I mean, the primary motivation for this was the change in the economy. During the period of legitimate trade, the British had the most advanced industrial capacity in the world. And as Shillington mentions, legitimate trade really favored the British. I mean, free trade favored the British because the British had the best industrial capacity, they had the best navy, they had the best merchant marine. And so they could undermine and undercut anybody else in terms of getting access to African markets and selling their products. Now, as the Industrial Revolution spread throughout Europe, you eventually get to the place in the 1870s, 1880s, where multiple countries in Europe, have a really good industrial capacity. And one of the things that happens that happened as they industrialized is that once you get to the point where you're capable of mass production, you have to have a market for your goods. And internal markets in Europe, they were being satisfied. Now, because of protectionism, there wasn't necessarily, you didn't have free trade between European countries. And so in their mind, the logical way to handle this would be to gain control of colonies. And Africa was the biggest untapped market. As you could see in chapter 20, Europeans had spent a lot of time exploring, sending people into different parts of Africa to try to figure out the river systems and that kind of thing. By the time you get to the 1880s, they pretty much know how the rivers work. And also, there have been some other technological changes that facilitated Europeans going into Africa. In particular, the drug quinine had been discovered, and this was the first time that there was a medicine that allowed people to control the symptoms of malaria. And so this now meant that instead of taking a ship into a place like the Niger Delta and having, say, 70 out of 100 people get really sick and possibly die. With quinine, uh, the level of fatality drastically dropped. Now, the other thing, too, is that Europeans had developed a better military capability. There had been some major wars in the middle part of the 19th century. The Crimean War, the American Civil War, the wars that brought about the unification of Italy and Germany that happened, basically from 1856 to 1871, there had been a number of major wars. And military technology had really improved. They had developed breech-loading rifles, the modern bullet. Yeah, you just take, for those of y'all familiar with guns, you open up the magazine, you put the bullets into the magazine, and you can shoot multiple shots. That technology, becomes effective technology in the latter part of the 19th century. Also, artillery shells are improved. Shells become rifled instead of like big cannonballs. You have rifled shells. Explosives are put into artillery. And then finally, the machine gun is invented. Now, these are big, like the Maxim gun and Gatling gun. They're big, heavy guns that have to be mounted. But still, they're capable of shooting many, many bullets at once. And so the medical and military technological improvements gave Europeans a huge advantage over Africans in terms of firepower. Now, the thing to understand is that by the time you get to the late 19th century, many Africans know how to make guns. In North in Senegal, in Nigeria, in many places, like for instance, if you all remember reading Things Fall Apart, the characters have guns. I mean, local blacksmiths know how to make guns, but they don't have the new breech loading technology. They don't have the new artillery technology. They definitely don't have the Maxim gun technology. And Europeans make up their minds that they are not going to make this available to Africans. Now, the one exception to this is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, because of the dynamics of politics in that area, the rule of Ethiopia, oh my goodness, Menelik II, he's able to get modern weapons, and that's why Ethiopia is able to defeat the Italians in 1896 and keep its independence, at least until Mussolini comes back in 1935. But except for that one exception, Africans don't get the modern weapons. And that's one of the things that Europeans actually agree on in treaty in 1885 in Berlin, is that they're not going to make the weapons available to Africans. And so this allows them to come in and effectively defeat Africans and gain control of territory. Now, one of the interesting things I want you all to notice in the book, and this is something that also has relevance for Things Fall Apart, is that by and large, Europeans are able to go in and defeat some of the really big political units. Because, if you have a king and the king has an army, you go fight the army, you beat them, and it's over. But for instance, Shillington mentions that in Nigeria, for instance, among the Igbo, and once again, this is relevant for Things Fall Apart, Eastern Nigeria is not completely conquered until 1910. It takes, the Berlin Conference is in 1885, but it takes another 25 years to effectively occupy Igbo territory in Eastern Nigeria, because the Igbo don't have a central king. They don't have an empire. I mean, each village, as you can see from the book, is independent. And so that meant that the Europeans the British had to come in there and beat each village. Now, the other thing to realize, too, is that, and we'll get into this later in later chapters, but the Europeans ended up practicing in a lot of places what was known as indirect rule. I mean, they were able to sign treaties with local African leaders. Once African leaders realized that the French or the British or whoever had superior military ability, they just said, well, hey, we'll work with you. We'll help you get the trade. We'll help you get what you need. And so African rule never 100% goes away. Many places retain African leaders. Or like in the case of things fall apart, where they didn't have African leaders, they actually created them in order to help them run the territory. And so these territories are run, Europeans may be on the top, but they're run effectively because of Africans. And also the army troops, the troops that Europeans used in these areas were largely African troops. And so really this is one of the disadvantages, from a political standpoint of Africa, is that Africa did not have, by and large, did not have that sense of nationalism, did not have that sense of unity. And it was really easy to get Africans from one part of Africa to come in and beat up on Africans in another part of Africa. And that really made colonialism much more effective. And so what we see is that in the period from 1885 to about 1900, or 1910 in some places, as in the case of Eastern Nigeria, Europeans were able to effectively come in and take over Africa, and to basically turn Africa into markets for their manufactured goods. Now, this also had a major impact on Africa in that, like, for instance, some of the older industries in Africa, like iron making, really began to wither away in the face of European imports. The same is true for textiles. Now, we'll get into that more in other chapters, but the bottom line is that when we look at this particular area, we see that because of the growth of the Industrial Revolution, because of competition for markets, and also because of the fact that they had the military capability to go in and take stuff over, it just made sense from a practical standpoint, and from a standpoint of economic planning, from the European perspective, to just go in and take over Africa and colonize it. And that's why it happened so quickly. As I said before, this is a pretty short lecture. Hopefully this is helpful to you.